Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We are sponsoring a series of events coinciding with Earth Month, Earth Week, Earth Day, now with our colleagues at the Smithsonian Institution and a host of European embassies, today with the Swedish Embassy and the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, on what we call Earth optimism. There's the climate challenge, energy transitions, environmental crisis. These are all very daunting for us. And we all focus on that, rightly so. But we thought it's also useful to know what's being done to address those challenges very practically. And so we're doing a series that tries to do that. Yesterday, we had an interesting discussion, which you can find on YouTube and on our website. Today we have one on hydrogen. Tomorrow we have one on offshore wind issues. Yesterday's was on the oceans. And we hope to continue this through the year to talk about practical solutions to some of the challenges we face in this space. So I'm very delighted today to have this event. Before I turn to our moderator, let me tell you how you can participate as an audience. You can do that by sending us a comment or a question by email at GEP, so Global Europe Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. Again, if you'd like to participate, you can do that with a comment or question. Send us an email at GEP@wilsoncenter.org or a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. So now it's my pleasure to turn this over to America Hernandez, who is the energy reporter at Politico EU, who's covering these issues for Politico, and she's going to moderate the program and introduce our speakers. America, thank you so much for joining us. And to all of our speakers today, we appreciate it very much. America, I turn to you.
Thank you for having me, and good morning if you're joining us from the States, or good afternoon if you're tuning in from Europe, where I am now. My name is America Hernandez. I'm an energy policy correspondent for Politico in Brussels, and I'm very happy to have been asked to moderate this event on the future of hydrogen. It's been a little over a year now, March 2020, that I was first put on the energy desk. And at the time, hydrogen was still considered futuristic, but somewhat niche subject in my folder, alongside the more traditional oil and gas, nuclear power. Boy, did that change quickly. The European Union launched its flagship Green Deal policy, a roadmap of sorts to meet its climate target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And part of that plan included a hydrogen strategy to get this clean burning gas to displace more polluting fuels. In it, the EU said it planned on spending as much as 460 billion euros, so that's more than 550 billion US dollars, to produce enough hydrogen to get us there by 2050. Now, the EU may have moved first, but the US and the world may soon be on track to overtake it. Before I hand it off to the experts, a few basics for those of you at home that might be a little rusty in your chemistry. Hydrogen is a gas, H2, and when it burns, it makes oxygen and water. It's pretty clean. The problem is how you make it. Generally, and again, we'll get to the experts who can tell you more details, but generally there are two basic ways. You can start with water, H2O, and a machine called an electrolyzer that gives you a little jolt of electricity, and that'll separate your H's and your O's, and you grab the H's. The problem there is if your machine is connected to a big power plant that's burning coal, that may not be very polluting compared to a wind turbine or a solar panel. The other method, and this is, I think, the way more than 98% of hydrogen today is made, is by taking natural gas. So methane, CH4, you rip out the C's and you're left with the H's. But if you don't catch those C's, what happens? They float into the air, they'll make carbon monoxide, they'll make carbon dioxide, and you're still polluting the air. So once you've gotten that right, which can be expensive, there's the question of what do you do with it? Currently, hydrogen is used mostly in the chemical and fertilizer sectors as a building block, but a clean burning fuel sounds like a big business. And there are a lot of people ready to start making cars, trains, planes, even piping hydrogen into your homes to heat apartments. Now, it can be done, but will it help save the planet? With this, I'll hand it off to our speakers, each of whom will give maybe about a 5-minute or less introduction. We have Dr. Julio Friedman, Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy. We have Renee Peters, Director for Gas Technology at TNO, that's the Organization for Applied Scientific Research in the Netherlands. We have Ms. Katie Perry, Deputy Vice President of New Energy Business at Siemens Energy. And we have Per Edgunge, Vice President at PowerCell in Sweden. Dr. Friedman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Wilson Center. I'm just delighted to be here on this important topic. As you've said, hydrogen has come roaring out of the gate this year in a way that I think has surprised a lot of people. It shouldn't be that surprising. It is one of the very few fuels we know of that doesn't have carbon in it. And as a consequence, if you use it as a fuel, then in fact, it doesn't directly emit carbon dioxide. It is also the case that now 50% of the nations in the world have made net zero commitments. These have been led by EU nations, but also include nations like China and Japan, enormous economies and enormous markets. These run on fuels today, and so you need zero carbon fuels to fit the bill. As a consequence, people who are in the fuel business and investors and governments who understand the importance of fuels are pivoting to hydrogen. Part of that is based on a net zero framing. If we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we got a lot of work to do. The International Energy Agency has made a set of scenarios, and one of them is the 2-degree scenario, limiting greenhouse gas emissions to a 2-degree warming scenario. That requires 580 million tons of hydrogen each year. That is up from 70 million today. So a factor of 8 times more. That is a lot of hydrogen. And it's all got to be zero carbon hydrogen. If we want to hit a 1.5-degree world, which is the goal explicitly of a lot of Paris nations and built into the Accord, then you need 780 million tons a year. So basically a factor of 10 times more hydrogen, and all of it's got to be zero carbon. That is a lot of work, but there's gold in them with our tons, and people want to get there. One of the other things that's changed is when we first talked about hydrogen, say 20 years ago or before, the focus was really on light duty vehicles. Now the focus is on everything else. People are really looking at heavy duty transportation, things like shipping, trains, and trucks. People are looking at heavy industry as a focus, so steel making and chemicals making, and those applications are growing in importance, and we're seeing nations beginning to do the hard work of organizing that. I have to reiterate, hydrogen in and of itself is not that useful if you end up increasing emissions as a consequence. It's really got to be near zero. So we're talking generally about green hydrogen, like America Hernandez said, from zero carbon electricity going into an electrolyzer, and that can be renewable or nuclear, or from conventional approaches like gasification or steam methane reforming, but you must capture the CO2 with it. And you have to have a high fraction of capturing, something like 80 or 90% at the end of the day. There's one column that we don't often talk about, though, which is biohydrogen. You can, in fact, take biomass, and our work has focused on solid wastes and agricultural wastes and so forth. If you gasify or convert biomass to hydrogen and you capture the CO2, you actually remove enormous volumes of CO2 in the process. And in fact, you can, if a conventional process today emits, say, 20 megatons of CO2 for every megaton of hydrogen, if you did that with biomass and captured the CO2, it would remove 20 megatons of hydrogen. It can be as big a negative remover as today it emits. I do want to say in closing 2 things. One, infrastructure is the most important part of this. We do not have the infrastructure today to do anywhere near what the IEA says we need. An infrastructure of all kinds, that is CO2 transportation and storage infrastructure, that is fueling infrastructure, that is refurbishing ports, that is building out electricity transmission networks. We don't have it. We got to increase, just if we wanted to do half of that volume with green hydrogen, we need to increase grid capacity by a factor of 3. And that is generation of zero carbon electricity and the transmission. We need to build ammonia storage facilities in ports. We need to retrofit ships. There is a lot of infrastructure that has to go into this to make it work. The other thing that I would say is that the world is changing very fast, and anybody who's asleep at the wheel will miss big commercial opportunities. That is true for companies. That is also true for nations. The EU is leading now, but it's not clear they'll be leading for long. The Asia Pacific region is moving very quickly in this arena, in part driven by Japan's policies to purchase low carbon hydrogen and ammonia. But it is also the case that the Gulf states are pivoting fast and hard to hydrogen production, both green and blue, and they have the resources to do it. Same thing with nations like Australia, Chile, Canada. All of these countries are coming on fast in the production of low carbon hydrogen. And that means that it is a jump ball. There is a lot of opportunity for people to get into the world and do this. And I think we are going to see a lot of dramatic investment in activity in a very short amount of time. I look forward to discussing this more. If you are interested, we will be having an event at the Center on Global Energy Policy this evening at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to discuss this more. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. I actually think that's a perfect transition to Mr. Renee Peters, the Organization for Applied Scientific Research, specifically talking about the infrastructure that needs to come. I'd be curious to hear a little about what you've been doing in the North Sea. Dr. Peters.
Yes, let's unmute myself. Yes, good afternoon from the European side. Let me give the European perspective on top of the US perspective from Julio on the role of hydrogen and the role of hydrogen in the full value chain. And as Julio already said, hydrogen is now considered as the way to actually reduce the CO2 emissions from the difficult part of the energy system, which is actually the heavy duty transport, which is the high energy intensive industries, which are strong in West Europe, like chemical, steel, refining, cement. And it's also the difficult to decarbonize heating applications, particular high temperature heating processes. Speaking about infrastructure, there's a big opportunity now in Europe, as in some parts of Europe are actually releasing some part of the infrastructures which traditionally was used for gas transport, particularly mentioning the Dutch infrastructure, which was partly used to transport gas from the natural gas field Groningen, the biggest onshore gas field in Europe, which will be closing down next year, and it will release a lot of infrastructure which was used for natural gas and will become available for transporting hydrogen. But furthermore, hydrogen is also very much needed to enable the offshore wind development in the North Sea to expand even further. Because up to 2050, the ambition is to put about 250 gigawatt of offshore wind in the offshore North Sea, even further offshore as it is now. And all that energy, that intermittent energy in the form of electrons, should be absorbed by the onshore grid in Europe, in the North Sea countries. And there are two challenges. One, first of all, the offshore grid the onshore grid is not sufficient to absorb all this energy. But secondly, the electricity from offshore wind, like from solar, comes intermittently, which means that you also have to balance the system with a storage when there's no sun or no wind. And that's where green hydrogen actually comes in as an enabler to actually balance the energy system by converting part of the offshore wind power to green hydrogen. And as we use pure 100% green electrons, we will also get green hydrogen. So actually green hydrogen produced from offshore wind is a key enabler to expand further growth of offshore renewables, both offshore and actually also onshore, and create a stable energy system where also large scale energy can be stored, also for longer periods of time, in the onshore subsurface storage options by, for example, salt caverns or depleted gas fields. And once about 60 to 70% of the electric grid is already decarbonized, you would need increasingly green hydrogen to actually balance the energy system and get a stable and also affordable energy system in Europe. So we expect from the 30s on, so in the next decade, we will need up to a scale of gigawatt level electrolysis technology, which can convert the offshore wind power towards green hydrogen. And that means we have to scale up from a level where we are currently today, which is about 1 megawatt, 1 to 10 megawatt, up to a gigawatt scale. So we have to ramp up to a scale of 1 gigawatt, 100 times bigger than where we are now. But we also have to reduce costs, because the electrolyzer is one of the most expensive part of this green hydrogen production process. And we have to bring down the costs with at least a factor of 10 in the next 10 years. So that means there's a huge challenge ahead of us to move to a large-scale green hydrogen economy, where we have to scale up the technology and bring down the costs at the same time, by moving from the small-scale demos that we are in now towards the large-scale implementation that we need in 2030. And the first start that we're making in Europe is a first demo site also for offshore hydrogen production in the North Sea, to demonstrate that in an offshore environment we can produce green hydrogen from offshore wind at a scale of 1 megawatt. And that's the pilot we call Poseidon, and you can find a demo of it on the website. So let me leave it to there with our big ambition ahead of us, scaling up and cost reduction at the same time in the next decade to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peters. And for those of you at home, that is Poseidon with the HY of the hydrogen.
That's correct. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And just one little note before I hand off to our next piece of introduction. I'm hearing some speakers throw around the terms blue versus green hydrogen. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but that's a little shorthand term. When we talk about hydrogen made from renewable electricity, people call that green. When people talk about natural gas and you capture the CO2, people refer to that as blue. And the basic plain old dirty polluting way to make hydrogen, people kind of call that gray. So not at all necessary, but in case you hear them, that's what we're referring to. And with this, I'd be very interested in hearing what Ms. Katie Perry has to say from Siemens Energy, because as I understand it, you are hard at work at quite a large electrolyzer.
Yes, absolutely. Let me share my screen if you don't mind here. Can everybody see it? Okay, perfect. So first off, thank you so much for inviting Siemens Energy to be a part of Earth Week. We really appreciate it. And as we continue to innovate and look towards the future, one of the biggest questions that we have is how do we tackle decarbonizing all of the different sectors? So I just wanted to give you some schematics to give you some visuals. As you can see on the screen, about 40% of the emissions come from the power sector, and Siemens Energy is currently helping our current customers reduce and help them with their decarbonization goals. Of course, there's much to do, and how do we do that with the remaining 60% of these sectors? So as Renee and Dr. Freeman had mentioned, we can use the PEM electrolyzer like the Siemens electrolyzer as a catalyst for these different sectors, such as the chemical industry, agriculture, petrochemical, mobility, with the help of renewables. And Siemens does have quite a large portfolio to help decarbonize the economy. So how do we do that? First, we know that decarbonizing the power sector is quite important, but we also know that we need to leverage our renewables to produce that green hydrogen that we just spoke about in our Power to X applications, which plays a huge role so that we can use it for re-electrification. And furthermore, there must be a bigger push for our regulatory framework to further excel our work, like providing incentives like the PTC and the ITC here in the United States, so that allows us to deploy our technologies at a faster rate. Right now, we are seeing quite a positive shift on Capitol Hill, and at the Department of Energy, they have awarded Siemens Energy with partnering with the LAWDP for the Intermountain concept study, as well as the Clemson University study in conjunction with Duke Energy as a partner. So this is another great schematic just for you to further visualize what hydrogen can do as multifunctional. So we start with our renewables, and of course you can use biomass as well. And then that, with some grid support, as Renee mentioned, the sun only shines part of the day, the wind only blows, not all the time. And so we want to use that, harness that as energy for a PEM electrolyzer. The other input is water. And then at some point you will need to store it or put it into a pipeline. And then that can go out to many different sectors, energy, industry, or mobility. So just to give everyone a vision of what we are up to at Siemens Energy, this is a schematic of what our Sealizer 300 looks like. It is currently on the market, and we are not new to hydrogen. We've been working on our hydrogen sector for over a decade. And as you can see here, it has 24 modules. Each one of these little stacks here is a module. And the power demand is 17.5 megawatts. Our efficiency is above 75%, and it produces 335 kilograms of hydrogen per hour. So we're very proud of this. We're excited to implement this here in the North American region. And maybe just to wrap up here. So Siemens Energy, this is nothing new for us. We've been in business for 170 years. Furthermore, hydrogen, as we continue to work on our R&D efforts, this is our current generation, which is our third generation, working on our fourth, which will have a sales release by 2023. And we offer full turnkey solutions for our customers from inception to installation, and we are ready to help those that want to help the world. Thanks.
How big is one of those things? Just out of curiosity, I'm seeing.
Yeah, actually the footprint is quite small. I don't have the figure offhand, but it's like 1/4 of an acre or something like that.
Oh wow. Okay. No, but so it's not the size of the rooms that each of us are sitting in, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so the electrolyzer is scalable as well. So you can scale this up to 1 gigawatt, and we are prepared to offer that for North America and furthermore throughout the world.
I think we're going to have to clear a lot of space to make all of this hydrogen.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your screen.
Of course.
And I think that this is actually, we're getting to where it gets even more interesting. I'd like to turn now to Per Edkunch from PowerCell in Sweden, which, as I understand, has been taking a lot of these concepts and putting them to work already in technological applications. So please let us know what you've been working on.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event here, and I'm very happy to see how this technology are produced. I've been working with fuel cells for over 30 years, so I'm now seeing how this technology really taking up to speed and see that they can be used a lot of different applications. And we at PowerCell has been developing fuel cell systems, and the fuel cell solutions since we was established in 2008 as with the aim to take the technology which had been developed with the Volvo groups at the beginning of the 90s to do it into commercial products. So we are, so the fuel cell as such is a device who convert the energy in the fuel to electric energy direct in the chemical reaction. So compared to a combustion engine where you first combust the fuel to get heat, and then to mechanical energy, we do it in one step, which makes that we have a higher efficiency and also have a true zero emission solution with no other byproducts than pure water. And the fuel cell is working more or less like a battery. It's an electrochemical reaction which create electric energy, but contrary to the battery where you consume your electrodes, so that you have to recharge, they get charged and you have to recharge the battery. The fuel cell will produce electric energy as long as you supply it with hydrogen. And within an application, we just stack the fuel cells on top of each other. So the number of fuel cell stacks, the fuels you have in your fuel cell stack can be changed depending on how much power you need and for different applications. So it's very easy to scale this technology for applications where you just need some watts or you're up to a megawatt solution, and you will still have this very high efficiency independent of the size of your fuel cell. So that's the reason why there are a broad field of application where you can use fuel cell, where you need power with high efficiency and without emissions. And we at the Power Cell are using this in different applications. So we are working in stationary fuel cells, we are doing marine fuel cells, but also on-road and off-road vehicle applications. For the on-road application, we're working together with Bosch, who have both a license to use our fuel cell technology for the automotive sector. So in this sector, they are supplying it for cars, buses, heavy-duty trucks, and as we already heard, the heavy-duty trucks is the application in the on-road, I think, which have the highest attention today because they're very difficult to find other way to decarbonize the heavy-duty truck due to the amount of energy what they have to carry with them. But we are using the same fuel cell stack technology that Bosch are doing for other segment and application, which means that we gain the economy of scale by using the same technology and platform. So we are delivering to the stationary market systems from 5 kilowatt up to megawatt systems, where they are used for peak power, for backup power and prime power, for powering data centers and other critical installation, but also using as combined heat and power sources for heating and powering buildings and industry. In the marine segment, we see the same, that it's very difficult to find other ways to carbonize this segment due to the huge amount of energy and power you need for big ships. So we are involved in several projects in this segment, where we are now also building a 3.2 megawatt system for a European shipyard, which is the biggest marine sold so far for a marine application. And in the off-road segment, we have developed a industrial solution with a scalable for 60 kilowatt up to megawatt solution, where we're supplying to customer in the field of construction equipment, agriculture equipment, marine equipment, and other working machines. But we also see that there are a lot of other applications where we're gaining interest in using our technology. So we see, looking at trains, where you can see that there are a tendency to see how you can replace diesel trains with fuel cell and hydrogen-driven solution. And also in the airplane application, we see the interest here. And since we have developed a very compact and high-power fuel cell solution, we got a lot of requests for for the aerospace industry. So we actually have delivered a fuel cell system for the first flying commercial airplane using hydrogen fuel cells. We delivered it last year. So the first flight was in September last year with the company Sarah in UK, used our fuel cells for powering this aircraft. So we see that there are a lot of interest in different applications and uses of the fuel cells. And we also see that there's this very big momentum for using hydrogen as an energy transition vector, due to the need to decarbonize a lot of different industries and applications. And as you said, we have this hydrogen roadmap in Europe. More than 30 countries already have implemented hydrogen roadmaps. We have a lot of initiative from industry where they are aiming on to putting up a lot of hydrogen projects. Over 200 projects is now have been announced for producing hydrogen in bigger amount. And we also, a lot of government are also announced support of this field with a lot of money. I think it was over 70 billion of US dollar had been committed to funding for hydrogen industry. So what we need to see now is that this announcement and strategies are materialized in concrete project with long-term targets, and we will have short-term milestones where we can fulfill that. And we also see that we need to start by in some hubs where we can concentrate the hydrogen production and need, like industrial centers, like ports or airports, where we have a lot of different off-taker who can share the investments and the risk and get down the cost by increasing the demand of hydrogen in these locations. So we really see that there are a lot of initiative and activity going on now where we can supply and support this industry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Edkunj. I'm already seeing some questions popping up from the people watching at home, some of which are centering around the obstacles, what we think the obstacles are in terms of allowing a hydrogen economy to roll out from a regulatory point of view. Even I see a question from an automotive journalist. She says, I've been writing about hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for more than a decade. How do you convince consumers it's got nothing to do with bombs? So there's definitely the question of the safety aspect, the question of how we're going to roll it out. And I think I'd like to perhaps start by going back to Dr. Friedman, because now Mr. Edkunj has just mentioned kind of the EU plan. There's been a lot of strategies, a lot of subsidies, and at least in my coverage here in the EU, it's very top down, right? You've got this European Union that has put out a strategy. They tell you how much money they want to put on the table. They do a call for projects, and then it kind of works that way. But I can imagine that it's very different in the US and around the world. So what are you seeing and what needs to come now?
Sure. So an awful lot to discuss. I'm glad that I can take the remaining 30 minutes on this topic. First of all, Europe really is leading in very substantive ways. People don't often understand quite how much money is there or how big the subsidy is. I wanted to point to just one. Recently, Germany removed what was called the EEG tariff, which was an electricity tariff on renewable power for electrolyzers. That is basically $3.50 per kilogram, or about $270 a ton. It is a massive, enormous incentive to get this stuff going, and as a consequence, we'll see stuff. Other countries are doing quite different things. The most noteworthy in my mind is Japan, because Japan is now the global market. They have agreed to go to net zero by 2050. Prime Minister Suga is pushing that. And as part of that, they have agreed to convert their entire power sector to hydrogen. Basically, they're moving all gas turbines to ammonia fuel made from zero carbon hydrogen. They are blending hydrogen into their coal boilers at high volumes, and they're building a shipping and heavy duty transportation industry on hydrogen. They are putting hydrogen into steel mills. Like, they're just going full tilt on this. That market, and they're paying a premium for it. They're paying roughly a 2x market green premium for the low carbon versions of this. That is in part what's driving this. Other countries are quite different. In the case of Chile, for them, it's the infrastructure. They're building ports. They're providing tax breaks for people who want to come build stuff. But here the incentive is really like, they already can make the lowest cost green hydrogen in the world. They just need to get it to market. And so their incentives are focused on that. In the US, it's a mix of things. Some innovation agenda through the DOE, discussion about something like a production tax credit or an investment tax credit for hydrogen, and extending the subsidies they already give for carbon capture and storage, 45Q, and also for low-cost electricity in the production tax credit, the electric tax credit. Also, they've put forward a tax credit for manufacturing, which will get more fuel cells on the market. They're talking about revamping 48C. And these are all parts of the American Job Plan, as well as bills in front of Congress. Not to be outdone, Canada has an extremely impressive hydrogen roadmap and is in fact putting in pipelines and is putting subsidies on the table, as well as a strong regulatory cap, $170 per ton carbon tax economy-wide. That will drive a lot of hydrogen. It'll start with blue hydrogen, but it'll move to green hydrogen and biohydrogen. Like, they're going to have it coming and going, and they certainly have the resources to do it. So I really, and last but not least, the United Kingdom, their plan is entirely infrastructure first. They're putting money into ports through a competition. And then second, through a contract for differences. And basically the contract for differences is for zero carbon electricity and offshore wind for CO2 storage. All those contract for differences will put hydrogen on the market in each of those industrial hubs. So it's marvelous to see all of this activity, and people realize that they have to be in this market to succeed.
Now, so you say market, and I think of Ms. Perry, because in our preparatory talks, you were telling me about some Siemens clients that would be interested in areas of North America where there's a lot of wind, a lot of sun, to take an electrolyzer and use it to power, whether it's a bus depot, I think you were mentioning. So, what are the kind of interesting applications, but what are the cost thresholds that you're looking to hit before that makes sense?
Yeah, so right now in North America, I think it's really sort of the gold rush, if you will, for hydrogen. A lot of developers, current customers, they are wanting to get in on it and they're not really quite sure how to do it. So a lot of them are maybe experimenting. We always say it's like two guys in a dream. They have an idea and they want to see it through. And so some of those sectors that we are seeing quite popular are mobility. They want to use the hydrogen for large trucking, for fuel cells. But then there's also hydrogen blending within pipelines, using it for fertilizer. It is also quite popular. I would say some of the more difficult parts of getting hydrogen just going are water rights. We have to think about where we're going to get the water from. It's wonderful that California offers so many tax incentives, but water is hard to come by in California. So a lot of customers are starting to flock just outside of California because they still want to sell the hydrogen back to California. And so they're moving maybe a little bit east of California, where the energy is not expensive, say Texas and Oklahoma, so that they have the water rights, they have the off-taker for their hydrogen, and they can see a successful business in it for themselves.
That's actually very interesting when you bring up the critical raw materials. There's a lot of people, they think about the energy transition, they think, we're moving away from oil and gas. We no longer will have to rely on this or that country that has got this in heaps. But in some of the questions I'm seeing coming up, people mention, lithium-ion batteries, another technology. They've got critical minerals that, again, are kind of sprinkled here and there across. So are there similar issues in addition to potential, access to non-salinated water that need to be taken account for hydrogen, either as a direct fuel for a fuel cell or just for the electrolyzer? And I leave this open to whoever wants to jump in on this.
Yeah, I can just say that there's always going to be challenges. We always want to be mindful when we have to use sort of precious metals for our products. And so we want to reduce that as much as possible with being innovative and finding new creative ways to create hydrogen. And I'll sort of leave it to the rest of the group, but water is just one of them. A lot of customers want to use renewables, but are not sure where to get it if they don't have one in their backyard per se for their project, or they're not willing to build one, so they have to use grid connection, which sort of doesn't completely squash the green hydrogen efforts, but it does reduce it to some effect, and so we want to be mindful of that.
I think Renee wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, if I can elaborate a little bit. I think it's clear if you want to produce hydrogen, you need access to cheap, clean water. And not every location has access to that, or it will be in competition to other users. But I think also on the material side, as you started with rare materials, that's also an issue both in electrolyzers and in fuel cells, where actually also rare components are being used for the anode and cathodes And probably Per can elaborate a little bit on that, but we are also working together with universities and academia to look at alternatives for these materials, which have much broader presence and same functional performance. But Per, maybe you want to elaborate on that as well, as it's also part of the fuel cell issues, I think.
Yes, that's right. So yes, we are using pressure metals as catalysts in the electrodes of the fuel cells. So we have platinum, mainly some other in that. But the amount of this platinum has been reduced dramatically over the last year. So today, I think we are in the range that you, for a car, have about the same amount of platinum in your fuel cells that you would have in your exhaust after treatment system if you have a conventional car. So the amount has gone down, and we also are involved in project together with partner here to further reduce it, but also to find other materials that can replace these materials. They are still not as efficient as the pressure metal, but the work is going on, and we see the progress in these technologies.
So I heard platinum. Did I hear magnesium?
No, platinum.
Platinum. And I think Dr. Freeman may wanted to add a point on that.
Yeah, I'm really not worried about the rare earth elements and critical materials part of this. I'm just not. The volumes we're talking about are pretty small. Even globally disposed, it's pretty small. Same thing with water. 1 million tons of hydrogen is like 10 million tons of water. That's like that's about 10 minutes of flow on the Susquehanna River. It's just not a big deal. Locally, it might be an issue. That's not the choke point. The choke point is the green electricity or the zero carbon power and energy you need. That's hard. That's really hard. We're talking about quadrupling the grid of the world just to make some hydrogen. And an extraordinary study that was done by the Energy Transition Commission, the ETC in Europe, said if you just wanted to fuel ships, if you just wanted to make hydrogen from ships with green electricity, you need to quadruple the world's power grid. You need 100 terawatt hours of electricity. That's a lot. We're not going to run out of rare earth materials. We're going to run out of places to build wind farms. There is a completely different set of challenges around here. And we don't have CO2 storage set up for the blue hydrogen pathways. We don't have the transmission lines. We don't have the land. We don't have the renewable power generations. All of those also have critical earth materials that are substantial. Like, I'm not worried about the thing we've been talking about. I'm worried about everything else.
Interesting.
I think you're perfectly right. For example, if you look at the Dutch use of hydrogen at the moment in industrial use for refining and chemical, if we want to fully green that from our wind power, we would have to install 10 gigawatts of wind, which is tenfold of what we have at the moment in the Netherlands, of wind dedicated for hydrogen production alone. And that is the existing demand, but the expectation is that demand will double or even triple in the next decades, if also mobility and more industries will use green hydrogen. So I think the big challenge is indeed the availability of low-cost, cheap green power. But it's also, of course, the cost reduction needed for the electrolyzers, because at the moment the cost of hydrogen is not dominantly determined by the cost of electricity, but it's still the cost of the capex of the electrolyzer for each kilogram of hydrogen. And as we all know, blue hydrogen at the moment is still at least twice as expensive as green hydrogen. So if the market would have to decide, they would at the moment decide for blue hydrogen, which is more driven by the CO2 tax and CO2 prices from the ETS system and local taxes, rather than the electricity price. So if we want to make the shift to green, also cost reduction of electrolyzers really have to go down rapidly.
Well, but
so
not
that I
just the
see as a market
electrolyzers.
barrier.
But not just the electrolyzers. 55% of the cost is the cost of the electricity.
Indeed, yeah, and that also has to go down. Yeah, but we're going quite fast on solar at least, and also wind is going in the right direction there. Yeah, but it has to go down further. I agree.
Now, I wanted to actually turn to Renee and ask something about the North Sea, because I was speaking to a few, let's say, offshore wind companies, who shall remain nameless, who were basically saying, well, we've just put out an announcement that we'll be making, one of the biggest wind farms offshore in the world, what people don't realize is that just to meet the EU's own targets, you have to put the equivalent of that biggest one in the ground every 6 months from now until we get to the target, just in terms of the infrastructure challenge. And that's not even, you know, getting the money for it, finding the investors in the space. It's also the red tape. I mean, I don't know what the status is in the US, but I believe that in certain European countries, due to protection of species, rare birds, very important, but it's gotten to the point where it's a tactic sometimes. You call for a study, how will this rare bird be impacted? The company goes through the process, everything is fine. You bring up another one, the process has to re-begin. So how does that play into the calculation, especially when you talk about taking existing infrastructure, platforms that are there for oil and gas, workers who are there, and changing those over to be for hydrogen?
Yeah, it's a very good point that you're making. Actually, if you want to install new infrastructure in an offshore environment or even also onshore, you would need in Europe at least 10 years, starting from the initial studies to getting permits and actually the construction phase. And actually, construction phase is that's for, let's say, a wind park or a gigawatt power cable. Now, if you start reusing existing infrastructure, this time can be shortened significantly, maybe even down to 3 or 4 years. And if you want to expand offshore wind to the level that is planned for, let's say 250 gigawatts in 2050, you cannot manage that with the traditional way of doing it, actually building a wind park, pulling a cable from shore, building transformer stations, and going through the normal processes, because we know already for now that the existing infrastructure is not capable of handling the ambitions we have for 2030. But if it takes 10 years to get permissions and planning procedures for the years beyond, we should have started already now. So the only way to get this accelerated deployment of offshore wind is to actually make use of the fact that we can reuse existing infrastructure, pipelines, for example, in the North Sea, which are currently used for oil and gas transport, and partly maybe reused for hydrogen. We have to check on the integrity of pipelines. It's all to be studied, but it looks like they can be reused and they will become available. And please note that a 36-inch pipeline can transport 15 to 20 gigawatt of energy in the form of hydrogen, which is huge, and which can save a huge amount of money as well on cable infrastructure, which you might have to produce otherwise. And it can accelerate the deployment of offshore wind. And what also helps, of course, is we can bring in the knowledge, the experience, and the expertise of the offshore oil and gas industry and workers who are known and experienced with working in offshore environment, installing an offshore environment, and operating in an offshore environment safely from their 50 years experience working in the North Sea. Which can be used for the deployment of offshore power to gas or hydrogen production, transport, and storage options in the same area. So we can also leverage on their experience and knowledge to build up this new infrastructure for hydrogen offshore.
So just based on what I'm hearing here, huge amounts of renewables need to be rolled out. It's very expensive. It takes a lot of space. It takes a lot of time currently. And this brings us to the question, after we've done this gargantuan effort, let's say, to get those in place, where does it make the most sense to deploy it first? I mean, I'm seeing we've got some niche experts here sending in questions who are throwing around the percentage of efficiency between hydrogen versus this or that type of battery. Doesn't it make more sense to rely on electrification? And I think somebody mentioned a few minutes ago that if you just look at the areas where hydrogen is used now, so not even talking about using it to power ships and planes and everything, but just the chemical, fertilizer, what have you, industries that need pure hydrogen to work. I mean, we would have to take all of the renewables that are going to the grid now and yes. More. So is there an order of operations that we see clear in terms of where we need to start concentrating this renewable power for hydrogen? And then added to that, how does that contrast with what investors are excited about and willing to fund?
I have to remind the engineers that I work with that there is no politician on God's green earth who wakes up and says, what's the thermodynamic and economic optimum? That's just not how they do this, right? There should be a staging order for this. And in fact, if you have renewable electricity, the most carbon abatement you get is to displace fossil carbon on the grid. Like, we know that. But electricity is only 40% of the solution set. If you electrify all the cars in the world and you zero out the emissions from today's grid, you've got 40% of the job done. Good for you, but there's another 60% to go. Hydrogen is most valuable in the other stuff. And I want to get people, if there's three things I want people to think about at the end of this, I'm going to be real brief here, three things. First of all, it is not green or blue, it's zero carbon, period. We got to be colorblind about this because we don't have time and we're limited in resources and everything's hard. So we got to make zero carbon molecules, focus on the carbon.
And
Second
when you
thing,
say that, you mean let's put nuclear to make it, let's take gas and capture it.
Nuclear is an option, biohydrogen is an option. And the policy should support the molecules that are zero carbon, whatever flavor they come in, because they all look the same to a fuel cell. You put them in a fuel cell, the energy service looks the same, right? So as long as we don't emit from making them, that's valuable. Second is every week is infrastructure week. For the next 30 years, every week is infrastructure week. If we're not building infrastructure today, we're going to fail. And it's not just building renewable power. We got to build everything else too. And I would encourage people to focus on ports, because ports, especially in Europe, is where the heavy industry is. It's where CO2 storage is. It's where the transmission is. It's close to the offshore wind farms. It's close to the gas. Like, it's close to everything. Ports are a good place to do this, and it's where commerce wants to invest. And then the last part is this: engineers don't work for hugs. This stuff is not free. Like, you have to create market aligning policies to get this stuff to market. And it is incredibly difficult to do all the three things I talked about, but it is no more difficult than the other 10 impossible things we have to do to get climate.
Well, but if we had to, and I'm asking this to everybody now, if we had to rank maybe the hardest versus the easiest challenges, because I mean, there's people asking us, how do you convince someone my hydrogen car won't explode, versus how do you convince the government that they should
stop talking about cars. First thing, stop talking about cars. Start talking about steel mills. Steel emits more than cars. Steel emits 7% of greenhouse gas emissions, cars emit 6%. It is a lot easier to get the steel mills done, and they use hydrogen. They could use completely hydrogen to make zero carbon steel.
Yeah, so look at the difficult to abate industry clusters or processes that cannot easily be electrified. Like if you want to produce ammonia, you will need a molecule, you will need hydrogen and nitrogen, of course, to produce ammonia, so you cannot electrify it. If you want to have steel production, but also cement production, maybe glass, high temperature process, very difficult with electrification. Hydrocracking, hydrotreatment, it all needs molecules. So a lot of processes that are not so easy to decarbonize with pure electrons, even if they are green, need hydrogen. So I would say that the difficult part of the energy transition can usually be served with hydrogen. Those are the processes where often now fossil fuels are being used to create the conditions that the processes can run. And indeed, for personal vehicles, please do this electrically, because that's the most efficient way and cheap way to do it. But if you go to heavy duty and maybe shipping or really heavy trucks, long haul distance trucks, there I think fuel cells as a sort of a range extender to an electric motor can play a great role, because that's where you cannot do it with a battery electric vehicle only. That's my view.
And just to jump off what Dr. Friedman said, speaking on the steel industry, Siemens has implemented our electrolyzer in Austria for steel production in Linz, Austria. So we are seeing other applications than just cars, right? And so the large trucking is just one portion, but to help our current customers, or even customers that haven't implemented hydrogen before, like someone that owns landfills, we can help reduce them, help them reach their decarbonization goals. And as far as investors go, you know, any investor wants to see a good business opportunity, and hydrogen is now and for the future. And so we are seeing that as long as a developer has a good business case with solid boundary conditions, investors want in on it.
I'd like to maybe have Per jump on that, because I sensed an internal cringe when Dr. Friedman said, forget about the car, when we have this spin-off from Volvo, you know, it's kind of this area where the fuel cell has been.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree on that. Of course, the heavier the vehicle is, the longer distances you go, then the hydrogen and fuel cell makes sense, because you need so much battery, and just transport batteries will not make any sense. So you can't have a long distance heavy duty truck going on batteries for longer distance. You really need energy carrier which have much less weight, like hydrogen. So that's right. But I mean, we also have another problem with electric cars, and this is the grid capacity. That we see that when the number of cars are increasing, we see that there is a limitation how many cars you can charge in a short time in the same place. So I mean, as I told you before, is that we have got requests for supplying fuel cells for recharging electric cars, because they can't. When they come, several steering wheel fast charging, they don't have this grid capacity, but they could continuously produce hydrogen, so they could have hydrogen and then have high peak power from the fuel cells.
Just to make sure that I've understood that correctly, you're telling me I'm seeing a line of electric cars ready to charge up, and there's enough cords, but the grid will cause a blackout.
I mean, yeah, the electric
so you're talking about a hydrogen standalone battery that would be kind of like a backup generator on site that would save the grid in these cases, essentially.
Yes, so we don't have this peak demand on the grid, so you can run the grid at much lower average power. So that our application were that, but for sure it is, the heavier the vehicle is, the farther go, the more advantages that use the fuel cell and hydrogen compared to a battery, absolutely.
Well, but again, a car battery costs $5,000 and it takes half an hour to charge.
Hmm.
A truck battery costs $60,000 and takes 40 hours to charge and takes 40% of the cargo hold. Like, this is not going to be the car application. It is more going to be like what Per described, where hydrogen is used to balance grid services or used to decarbonize shipping or some other hard to abate sector.
Turning to the question box, actually, I think that we've answered quite a few of them, except for one question on nuclear fission, but I think that might be, excuse me, nuclear fusion, because we have nuclear fission. But nuclear fusion, I think that's still at least several decades in the future and not necessarily a competitor to hydrogen.
It's not. Let me say that fusion is the energy of the future and always will be. We have, I know we're turning on ITER in a couple of years, but we'll see what happens. Nuclear fission, different story. We can use that today to make hydrogen, and people are. What I do think is interesting, we're just beginning to see an opportunity to make hydrogen from high temperature fission in advanced hydrogen cycles, like iodine sulfur cycles or water cracking and stuff like that. I think we're still 20 years away from that. But again, as land use becomes an issue, as infrastructure becomes an issue, that may end up being interesting. We'll have to see. We have to start valuing the carbon if we get serious about this. And if we are interested in low carbon, nuclear should qualify.
Well, maybe good to add here, Julio, there is one technology under development, and we're working on that as well, which is actually direct pyrolysis of methane into black carbon and hydrogen. So what you get is actually two valuable products, not only the hydrogen, but also pure carbon, which is actually a feedstock in some of the production processes as well. It's still a low maturity technology, but it is being demonstrated on pilots, and it could be some of the future technologies for producing low carbon hydrogen from natural gas or other carbon hydrocarbons.
Well, this may be a good place to end the discussion because there are a lot of innovative pathways to making and using hydrogen that we're just starting to look at. And I'm sure that companies like Siemens are deep into that already. But as part of their work, nations around the world should have an innovation agenda paired with the infrastructure and investment agenda, because it's every bit as important to make the future we need.
And on that, I think I'd like to go around the virtual table and ask you all if there was one hydrogen wish that you could see granted in the next quarter, what would it be?
Nobody wants to go.
Oh no, for me, in the US, it would be a hydrogen production tax credit on the order of $1 to $2 a kilogram. If we had that, we'd be making molecules.
Yeah, I would say it's very encouraging what's happening in Capitol Hill. I hope it continues to see more of a regulatory framework with more incentives for our customers.
Your one wish, your one incentive wish.
Bigger tax incentives for our customers.
Okay.
For me, I would say a better EU regulatory framework to enable a cross-border EU hydrogen backbone to transport hydrogen throughout Europe and connect all the industry with the production centers.
Okay. Mr. Egdunge?
Yes, I think that for us, in our application, I think the availability and the affordable hydrogen will be a key for us. So building up of the hydrogen production and getting up in scale.
So what's your golden price?
Pardon?
Your golden price. You talk about a low price for hydrogen. What's your golden price?
Yeah, I mean, this is different for different application. So depending if it's trucking or if it's marine, there are different kilo, but we are talking about $3 per kilogram, something like that.
$3 a kilo. All right. Well, thank you all so much.
So that's carry.
Oh.
No.
Yes. Thank you all so much for participating on this talk on hydrogen, fuel of the future. Again, I'm America Hernandez, Energy Policy Correspondent at Politico Europe. We had with us today Dr. Julio Friedman from Columbia University's Global Energy Policy Center, Renee Peters, Gas Technology Director at TNO, the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research, Katie Perry, Deputy Vice President for New Energy Business at Siemens, and Per Egdunge, Vice President of PowerCell in Sweden. Thank you for your questions, and please do tune in for the rest of Smithsonian Wilson Center's Great Week. And with this, I wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you.